We utterly deny all outward wars and strife, and fighting with outward weapons, for any end or under any pretense whatsoever. This is our testimony to the world.
This is the peace testimony, first proclaimed in 1660 to King Charles II of England by a group of religious seekers led by George Fox and calling themselves the Children of Light, or Publishers of Truth. To their critics, they were known as Quakers, a derisive nickname that they unabashedly acknowledged as they were known for trembling under the influence of the Holy Spirit in their worship meetings. Ultimately, they would officially name themselves the Religious Society of Friends. Their visionary leader, George Fox, wrote in 1683,
God, who made all, pours out his Spirit upon all men and women in the world, in the days of his new covenant, yea, upon whites and blacks, Moors and Turks and Indians, Christians, Jews and Gentiles, that all with the Spirit of God might know God and the things of God, and serve and worship in spirit and truth. Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people, and to them then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in every one.
That of God in every one, as it was originally used, really referred to people being made in the image and likeness of God. We all share the same Father, the same parents. We're all children of God. We're all children of the same God. We need to recognize that. That's what we need to be responding to in other people, is that common humanity that we have, the inward light of Christ. And just as the light from the sun allows us to see with our eyes, our outward eyes, we have inward eyes. And when we are illuminated by that inward light of God, we can see our spiritual condition and understand what it is God's calling on us to do.
As the movement grew in number and momentum, that inner light led Quakers to pivotal roles in many of the most transformative moments of the last 4 centuries. Quakers such as William Penn, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, John Woolman, and George Cadbury have achieved a degree of fame, but less is known about thousands of other friends, such as those from the American Midwest, whose faithfulness to Quaker ideals positively impacted the larger society. And these are the previously untold stories of some of those architects of peace and equality. Quakers left England in the 17th century to establish a colony in the New World, William Penn's Holy Experiment. Inspired by the idea of living where they could be governed according to their faith, Penn had been given the land by King Charles II to settle a large family debt.
So in 1682, he sails across the ocean with a group of colonists, most of whom are Quakers. But he doesn't say to the people already living there, "This is mine." What he says is, "I'm going to buy it." He says this not only to the Swedes and the Dutch, he says it to the Indians as well. He says, this is land that we want to settle on. We recognize it as your land, and we will purchase it from you. And begins the first of a number of treaties that Penn and his sons make with the Indians to buy land that the king has already given to Penn.
After an encounter with Penn, Tamanind, a Native American Delaware chief, declared,
"We will live in love with William Penn and his children as long as the creeks and rivers run, and while the sun, moon, and stars endure."
Penn writes this Constitution allowing people freedom to worship, abolishing the death penalty, except in some very few. I think if you engaged in treason, you could still be executed. But beyond that, this was an amazingly liberal document that he put together.
The Quaker colony, Pennsylvania, was open to all and governed with laws based on equality, truth, simplicity, and peace.
Peace requires justice. Justice requires law. Law requires government, not only within nations, but also between nations. William Penn, 1693.
If you could only build a state where people would be free, they could have freedom of religion, they could have freedom to express themselves, there could be equality, women could be as equal as men, could have the same rights, could do the same things as men, there would be no need for to own slaves, that each in their own way would give to the community, that you would have a just government, that would look out for everyone within the society.
Unfortunately, by the time of the American Revolution, there were more non-Quakers than Quakers in Pennsylvania, and the holy experiment came to an end as Quakers were voted out of office or left office rather than participate in decisions related to war-making.
He thought he was going to establish a utopia, a heaven on earth, and found out that the tough realities of life really get in the way. But he did create this colony. He created this model. We have the model of religious freedom that Penn establishes in Pennsylvania. I mean, the Constitution of the United States, in some ways, draws on things that he wrote in the 1680s, almost 100 years earlier.
Though they were no longer a majority in Pennsylvania, Quakers had spread throughout the American colonies with substantial settlements in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. As the colonies in the new land developed, slavery became a part of the economic system, but Quakers were to follow a different path. Through the 1700s, Friends urged their members who owned slaves to free them and make provisions for their welfare. And by 1784, virtually no Quakers owned slaves.
The slave economy became strong in the South. So in 1806, my family group of Quakers moved from the North Carolina Piedmont area to Ohio. They did not want to raise their children in that slave society. So it was a matter of conscience and also a matter of economics, a matter of looking for a life that would be better for their community and their families.
Appalled by the cruelty of slavery around them and attracted to the possibility of living where slavery was prohibited, many Southern Quakers began moving to the Northwest Territory, settling first on land that now includes the states of Ohio and Indiana.
In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which was to provide for the organization of government and settlement of the lands north of the Ohio River. What was probably the best element of the ordinance, however, was its provision that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would ever exist in the lands of the Northwest Territory. And Friends are drawn toward territories where slavery is illegal.
Daniel Boone, who grew up a Pennsylvania Quaker, was among those who helped Friends move west in search of a place to live in peace and equality.
Let peace, descending from her native heaven, bid her olive spring amidst the joyful nations, and plenty, in league with commerce, scatter blessings from her copious hand. Daniel Boone, 1784.
In 1799, 2 Quaker families from Bush River, South Carolina, settled on military lands in southwestern Ohio, just north of Fort Washington, the site of what would, in a few years, become the thriving river port town of Cincinnati. In 1803, joined by more migrating Friends, they established the first formally recognized Quaker meeting for worship, or church, in southwestern Ohio, Miami Monthly Meeting in the village of Waynesville. And that same year, something was to happen back in Bush River, South Carolina, that would open the floodgates for Quaker migration to the Northwest Territory. Zachariah Dix, a Quaker described by those who heard him speak as a powerful, rhapsodical preacher with prophetic insight in an unusual degree, delivered a disturbing message.
By the 1790s, Friends had come to believe that Zacharias had a gift of prophecy, that he could see into people's minds and understand what their secret spiritual states were, and that he had foreshadowings of the future. As Friends recorded their memories of his preaching decades later, what Zacharias had to say to them was something like this: "Woe unto thee, Bush River, the flower of thy glory has faded. Get thee hence out of this land of Egyptian slavery and darkness unto the free lands of the Northwest." And within a few years, a Quaker community that had numbered probably close to 1,000 people was fewer than 100 left in South Carolina.
The Quakers who came here to the Midwest were those who were maybe more risk takers. They left homes and well-established farms and villages and families back east and moved west. And a lot of Quakers stayed on the east, where their farms and families were, and they did good work there. But the ones who came west took all sorts of risks and chances. And it strikes me, we may know less about them because they were doers more than writers. They didn't necessarily sit and write down what they had done. They were out there just doing it.
A large number of Quakers continued migrating to present-day Indiana and Ohio, just like those from Bush River, faithfully following guidance from their inner light.
Quakers, wherever they formed communities, first formed a meeting for worship. The next thing they did was to open a school for their children. Those Quaker schools are often admitting non-Quaker students. And some of them gain a reputation as being some of the best secondary schools in the Midwest. After statehood in 1803, a public school system was set up, but Black children were not admitted to it. Even though Black landowners were forced to pay taxes that subsidized the public schools, their children could not attend those schools. So if Black children were to be educated, that means that their parents or sympathetic whites had to make that possible.
In Harveysburg, which is just a few miles from Waynesville, there was a Quaker meeting there. And there were 2 Quakers, Elizabeth Harvey and her husband. They started the first for children of color in Ohio, which was early and really unheard of at the time, and highly frowned on, and got a lot of criticism from people who weren't Friends.
One of the things that really feeds freedom is it's not a place to hide, but a place where you can learn, a place where you can become a part of the economic community, build a home for your family, and then send your children back to school. And Harrisburg created a school for black students, and then even hired black and white teachers. And so it was important because it started at the base.
For early Friends, of course, this is just plain scripture. Equality is, you look in the epistle from Paul, and it says, in Christ there is no male or female, there is no Greek or Jew, there's no slave or free. If we are part of the body of Christ, we are all the same. And so the social distinctions that were made, and still are made to a degree, between people with different backgrounds, different genders, those are all irrelevant. Those are all outward things, but internally, we are all, as I said, children of God, and all equally children of God.
As more and more of the country began relying upon slave labor for productivity and cost savings, Quakers throughout the Northwest Territory continued to make the difficult and dangerous choice of supporting freedom for all. Christopher Anthony, founding member of the Quaker meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio, was one of many Quakers to give up his reliance on slave labor.
Mary P. Hart was Christopher Anthony's granddaughter. And fortunately, she had the wherewithal to share her memories of the meeting house and some of the oral history of her family and how they came to arrive in Cincinnati.
The household goods came in wagons, and with them a family of Negroes. The man was a descendant of a slave of grandfather's before grandfather joined the Society of Friends, at which time he set all his slaves free. Mary P. Hart.
Even for Quakers living in the slavery-free Northwest Territory, it was impossible to avoid being drawn into the most contentious debate in the history of our nation. Many Friends combined intellect and creativity to overcome opposition to their work for peace and equality. Levi and Catherine Coffin are prime examples of such moral ingenuity.
In the 1830s and 1840s, the town of Newport in Wayne County, Indiana, had a reputation as being one of the most radical anti-slavery centers in the United States. It was widely known that hundreds of fugitive slaves had passed through Newport, most of them through the Coffin home. And he estimated that, I believe in the course of their lives from 1826 to 1865, they had aided somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 fugitives. And to the best of his knowledge, none of them was ever seized and returned to slavery. Well, Levi Coffin was an effective conductor on the Underground Railroad, not just because he was a committed abolitionist, but also because he was a smart, committed abolitionist. He knew that if slave catchers invaded Newport or even his home, they would have the force of law behind them. And so he tried to think of ways that he might be able to outwit them. And you can see three examples of that here at the house. The first is the well, which is inside. And of course, that would have been convenient. But it also had the advantage that snoopy neighbors who might not be sympathetic would never be able to notice just how much water the Coffins were drawing for their own use or for the 18 fugitive slaves that they might have with them at any given time. In the attic, there is a hiding place, one where people could have been concealed if necessary. They also have a false bottom wagon, which would have been another effective way to transport fugitive slaves. They would have been particularly in danger when they're on the open road. So if you think that slave catchers may be on your trail, the false bottom wagon is an excellent way to transport a freedom seeker. I think, to me, it's a good example of combining practicality with a moral witness.
He didn't try and hide from the sheriff. He was just open about it. And this is the way, this is what real civil disobedience is about. Civil disobedience is saying, this law is wrong, I'm not going to follow it, and doing it out where people can catch you if they want to. He didn't hide the fact that he was not just a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was described at the time as the president of the Underground Railroad, and he was described that way publicly.
In his memoir, Levi Coffin recounts a conversation with a man who disapproved of his helping slaves escape from their masters.
I told him I had read in the Bible when I was a boy that it was right to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, and to minister to those who had fallen among thieves and were wounded, but that no distinction in regard to color was mentioned in the good book. So, in accordance with its teachings, I had received these fugitives and cared for them. I then asked, was I right, friend, in doing so? He hesitated and seemed at a loss how to reply. I continued, how does thy Bible read? Was it not as I have said? Yes, he answered, it reads somehow so. He evidently wished to change the subject. Levi Coffin.
In addition to helping fugitives escape from slavery, Coffin and other abolitionists worked to undermine its economic foundation, buying and selling products such as cotton and sugar from plantations that hired free laborers instead of using slaves. In 1846, a group of abolitionists decided to establish a free labor wholesale warehouse in Cincinnati and urged Levi Coffin to oversee its operation. In the spring, Levi and Catherine Coffin moved from their home in Newport, Indiana to Cincinnati, Ohio. Throughout their years in Cincinnati, the Coffins also helped those who sought freedom by providing opportunities for education, teaching simple skills denied those oppressed by slavery.
People like Levi Coffin not only provided you with shelter, but then provided you with hope. And helping black people learn to read and write in the basement of Union Baptist Church, that's freedom. And even if they catch you and take you back, they don't own you anymore. Coffin and other people like him understood that physical freedom with no job and no way to take care of your family is just another form of slavery.
Another Cincinnati friend who took the testimony against slavery particularly to heart was Mordecai Morris White. His maternal grandfather was a wealthy plantation owner, and in 1846, when Morris White was only 16 years old, he inherited a large estate from his grandfather, including a number of slaves.
When he was in his early 20s and living in Cincinnati as a young businessman, the realization that he was a slave owner began to bother him. So he made the journey on horseback all the way down to North Carolina, registered his slaves so that, to establish his ownership and his ability to free them. And then at 3 a.m, started on a journey back to the Midwest. When he got to Norfolk, he was offered $10,000 in gold for his gang of slaves and turned it down.
The personal property value of the 6 million slaves in the South was worth more money than all the factories and inventory of everything up north. And so when you ask that be taken away and given away, that would be like telling Procter & Gamble to give away all their soap. We don't realize how much value there was, and we don't have any idea of what it was like to have the courage to run away.
Eventually, Mordecai White's group made its way to Raysville, Indiana, a settlement of Quakers and free people of color where White had relatives. There, White rented and furnished 2 houses for his former slaves and found jobs for the men chopping wood, making fencing rails, and other employment that would allow them to provide for themselves.
It's a risk to let your life speak what you believe. So it doesn't matter what you say you believe. If your actions are showing a different belief, then it doesn't matter. But it is risky.
Quakers who did not directly protect and guide slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad found other ways to contribute, such as Cincinnati friend Achilles Pugh and Kenton County Quakers Isaac and Sarah Harvey.
Pugh owned a printing company that published The Philanthropist that was written by James Byrne. Byrne was like Levi Coffin and like John Rankin from Ripley, and that Byrne was a Southerner. Byrne was the son of a slave owner from Danville, Kentucky, who said, "This isn't right." And so here is a guy of privilege who has a strong moral base and just turns his back on wealth and started writing this paper. And some of the citizens of Cincinnati burned his press twice and dumped it here in the Ohio River.
What's worse, they decided to go to Achilles Pugh's house that night to make sure that he didn't have any more printing equipment handy. And it had to have been a terrifying experience to have this angry mob at your front doorstep with your wife and your children there in your home. Fortunately, they didn't commit any violence. And he could have said to himself, "This is too dangerous. I'm not going to do this anymore." Instead, he went back to his printing press, literally picked up the pieces, and continued publishing The Philanthropist.
There are certain individuals who exemplify what it means to be a Quaker and what it has meant from the beginning. And one of the qualities is a degree of faithfulness to a leading, to communicating or being communicated with God and listening. And Isaac and Sarah Harvey are a good example of that.
In the late summer of 1862, he was plowing in his field. And can you imagine walking behind horses and a plow? And that must be a very meditative kind of experience, you know. So he was doing this, and he heard a voice that said, "Go to Washington and talk to the president." And he said, I don't know, he didn't know whether the voice was outside or inside, but he said, "I hear you." So he unhitched his horse and took care of his horses, went to the house and said to his wife, Sarah, "Will you go to Washington with me to see the president?" And she, in her Quaker way, says, "Who sends thee?" And he says, "The Lord." So, of course, she's ready to go with him, and they do.
The Civil War was underway, and the country was divided and devastated by both war and slavery. But Isaac Harvey was convinced God had given him a message to share that might provide the solution.
So Sarah and Isaac Harvey get off the train in Washington, D.C. They don't know the city. They don't know anything about it. They look across the street. There's a fellow standing over there by a street lamp. So they go over to him and ask directions to the White House. They've come to see the president. And so he asks them a few questions, and it turns out that he is Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. He is from Cincinnati. He had served several different political offices, including governor of Ohio. When he finds out they're from Wilmington, and he knows they're Quakers and he knows the area, he takes them, he says, "Come with me, I'll get you settled." He takes them to a boarding house or something and finds them a room, and he sets up an appointment with them to go see Abraham Lincoln.
So they went into the waiting room, and many people reading the newspaper, because the Battle of Antietam had just been fought, and the North had won, but there had been many, many casualties. So they waited, thinking certainly they would probably never get in with all these important things going on. But at their appointed time, President Lincoln called them in, and they reported that President Lincoln picked up his chair and came over and sat between them, and so that he could talk to them more personally. And so they talked for about half an hour, and at the end of that time, President Lincoln signed a note saying that they had visited with him, that they had comforted him, and dated it.
I take pleasure in asserting that I have had profitable intercourse with friend Isaac Harvey and his good wife, Sarah Harvey. May the Lord comfort them as they have sustained me. Abraham Lincoln, September 19th, 1862.
About 2 days after the Harvey visit, the first draft of what would become the Emancipation Proclamation was given to the Congress. In this preliminary version, Lincoln includes in his second paragraph almost exactly what Isaac Harvey had suggested, and that is that the U.S. government purchase slaves from the South.
On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the following.
That it is my purpose, upon the next meeting of Congress, to again recommend the adoption of a practical measure tendering pecuniary aid to the free acceptance or rejection of all slave states so called, the people whereof may not then be in rebellion against the United States, and which states may then have voluntarily adopted, or thereafter may voluntarily adopt, immediate or gradual abolishment of slavery within their respective limits.
And the wonderful thing that happens when you do that when you're faithful like that, is that you are able to do things you shouldn't be able to do. You shouldn't be able to just arrive, get off the train in Washington, D.C., and make your way to see President Lincoln. And when you have that kind of confidence, you are not alone, and you accomplish incredible things. And that's along with this idea of George Fox when he said, "Let your life so preach." In other words, your life will, what you do, if you are faithful and tuned in and listening and you act on them, your life will speak what you believe. And so it's a powerful message to watch someone live a faith and not just say it.
Since the 17th century, the official Quaker position has been that all wars and fighting are contrary to the will of God, and that friends as faithful Christians can never bear arms to deprive fellow human beings of their lives, even in self-defense. The Civil War is different. They see the Confederacy as committed to the defense of slavery, and that in Quaker minds makes it absolutely immoral, indefensible. So that's the choice that friends are facing.
If we truly accept and believe that there is indeed that of God in every person, then we must be a peacemaker. We must give full justice and equality to every person, and seek the peace and justice that the world needs and that the Spirit requires of us.
Just as the country was divided, so were Quakers. Torn between their abhorrence of slavery and their testimony of peace, a large number of young Quaker men joined the Union Army. A larger number, however, elected not to participate in violence. For this, they were labeled as cowards and faced derision and humiliation by society at large. Although Quakers were not willing to kill for their principles, they were willing to suffer and even die for them. The 1864 Friends Discipline for Quakers in Indiana and southwestern Ohio acknowledged the challenges of the peace testimony in wartime.
If during the common course of their life, friends are attacked, insulted, and persecuted, they ought to suffer wrong, to revenge no injury, to return good for evil, and love their enemies. So also should it happen that they are exposed to the more extraordinary calamities of war, their conduct must continue to be guided by the same principles. If the sword of the invader be lifted up against them, the precept is still at hand, that they resist not evil. If the insults and injuries of the carnal warrior be heaped upon them, they are still forbidden to avenge themselves, and still commanded to pray for their persecutors. If they are surrounded by a host of enemies, however violent and malicious those enemies may be, Christian love must still be unbroken, still universal.
While withstanding verbal and sometimes physical persecution, friends found ways to contribute solutions while avoiding violence. For instance, Mary J. Taylor, clerk of the Women's Meeting in Cincinnati, organized assistance for soldiers who were encamped in Garfield Park, and her son, Dr. William H. Taylor, provided medical services to the wounded. Other Cincinnati area friends were challenged to action as well.
Endeavor as way may open to relieve in some measure the colored people now at or near Cairo, who are without a home in consequence of the war now existing in our beloved country, and who by the laws of the land are most likely entitled to freedom from slavery. At this time there are about 4,000 persons, principally women and children, at or near that place, the able-bodied men being mostly employed in the opposing armies, leaving their helpless fathers, mothers, wives, and children without the means of support. 1862. There were slaves who were caught in the middle of battlegrounds, so there was dreadful suffering among the people who were slaves and were now, according to the law, freedmen, but they were not free from suffering and poverty and so on.
Quakers formed various committees to provide support for those suffering because of the war, including the Indiana Yearly Meeting Committee on the Concerns of the People of Color and the Committee for Contraband Relief, which included representatives from Cincinnati Friends Meeting, Achilles Pew, and Murray M. Shipley, among others. As the war came to a close, and for years to follow, Quakers were involved with picking up the broken pieces of society and working to rebuild it.
According to some sources, during the Civil War, Murray Shipley was involved in helping to establish schools in the South, which involved going down the Mississippi River under fire at times from either the Union forces or the Confederate forces, so that he could bring relief to the people in those areas.
Levi Coffin and other Quakers in the Cincinnati area made trips down to Alabama, Mississippi to see what was going on. They came back, they raised money and funds, and they started this Western Freedmen's Commission to continue to get food and clothing and supplies and relief for the suffering people. One of the first things they did, besides feed and clothe the slaves, was build schools and start teaching them, because they understood that they would have a better chance of surviving in this new world, whatever it was going to be. To survive, they're going to have some of those basic skills.
After the Civil War, you had 4.5 million people of African descent, most of whom had no formal education. And Coffin not only helped them in the process of getting away, at least 2,000, but he then helped an even larger number with the kind of programs that the Freedmen's Bureau set up. Establishment of schools, establishment of social services that people with nothing needed to begin to become full-fledged citizens.
When Coffin died in 1877, his service was held at Cincinnati Friends Meeting House. 4 of the 8 pallbearers were freed black men. One of the speakers was Reverend Dr. Rust, secretary of the Freedmen's Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Levi Coffin had too great a mission to spare any time to take care of himself, and God took care of him. He was an honest, wise, and judicious man. Wise in selecting the most practical and judicious methods. He was a brave and courageous man. It would take less bravery to go up to the cannon's mouth than to do the work he did. As he walked through the streets, he was hooted at and threatened by mobs. The battlefield has no such illustrations of heroism as he exhibited every day. Reverend Dr. Rust, 1877.
The African American community in Cincinnati held fundraisers to build a memorial for him, but it was Quaker practice to maintain simplicity and equality even in death. So, in accordance with his wishes, Catherine Coffin had her husband buried in an unmarked grave in the Meeting Cemetery. When Catherine Coffin died in 1881, she was also buried in an unmarked grave in the Friends Cemetery. 20 years later, in 1901, Cincinnati Friends Meeting was informed that persons not in membership with us desire to erect a monument to the late Levi Coffin on our lot in Spring Grove Cemetery. Cincinnati Friends Meeting granted permission to erect a monument so long as Friends approved of the inscription. Among a few simple headstones in the Quaker section of Spring Grove Cemetery stands a single 6-foot marker, dedicated in a ceremony on May 30th, 1902. Inscribed on the monument are the following words.
Levi Coffin died 9th month, 16th, 1877, in his 79th year, a Christian philanthropist. Catherine Coffin died 5th month, 22nd, 1881, in her 78th year, her work well done. Noble benefactors aiding thousands to gain freedom, a tribute from the colored people of Cincinnati.
After the Civil War, another group that garnered the attention and sympathies of Quakers were Native Americans, specifically the Cheyenne, Wichita, and Comanche tribes.
One of the delicious ironies of American history was that when General Ulysses S. Grant became president in 1869, he decided that the U.S. government needed a new Indian policy, one that emphasized peace, one that took the administration of Indian affairs away from the Army and private contractors and agents who were often corrupt, and turned it over to the churches, people who presumably would be humanitarian, who would practice peace on earth, goodwill toward men.
In 1869, when a group of Quakers went to see President-elect Grant and made the suggestion that instead of soldiers as Indian agents, people of faith be appointed, Grant listened attentively to the Quakers and responded.
Gentlemen, your advice is good. I accept it. Now give me the names of some friends for Indian agents, and I will appoint them. If you can make Quakers out of the Indians, it will take the fight out of them. Let us have peace. Ulysses S. Grant.
Thus, President Ulysses S. Grant was led to pursue what became known as the Quaker policy, the appointment of friends and other clergy to oversee the corruption-ridden Bureau of U.S. Indian Affairs and to act as Indian agents across the country, distributing funds and supplies to tribes who were losing more and more of their land to settlers from the east and being forced to live on reservations. It is believed that much of the motivation for involving the Quakers was their positive reputation among Native American communities.
Now, William Penn started that. When he came to Pennsylvania, he made treaties with the Indians. These treaties were not broken. They purchased land. They tried to be as honest as they could and as equal and fair to the Native Americans. So that tradition was handed down through the society. And they built schools, helped them build mills, and provided the things so that the Native Americans could establish their own homes and make a life for themselves.
Once again, many of those involved in the effort came from the Midwest. Cincinnati friend Murray Shipley served as chairman of the Associated Executive Committee of Friends on Indian Affairs, and other members of Cincinnati meeting were appointed as Indian agents, including the indomitable Harriet Steer, who spent several months with tribes in Missouri, and Achilles Pugh, who traveled to Kansas and Oklahoma Territory with two other friends on the Associated Executive Committee. Initially, Quakers seemed to have the support of the general public in their work with the Plains tribes. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune reported,
"The Quaker agents are unwearied in their efforts for the amelioration of the Indians' condition and honest in dispensing the rations and annuities they are entitled to receive. Under the old system, the agents seldom lived with the tribes, while the new agents abide with them, and this is a great advantage." Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, September 23, 1869.
However, many Western settlers were not fans of the experiment.
Many of them were of the school, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. When they saw Quakers coming in, urging justice for Native Americans, pointing out how very often local officials, white settlers, were stealing from Native Americans, encroaching on their lands, withholding government funds that were rightly theirs. This did not endear Quakers to those people. So soon, Washington was being inundated by complaints from settlers that the Quakers were completely unrealistic and that they were endangering the lives of settlers.
Unfortunately, the trust placed in the Quakers by President Grant was not shared by officials in the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes. In 1879, encountering antagonism and lack of cooperation by government officials, Quakers withdrew from government-sponsored work and instead directed their efforts toward establishing Quaker meetings, building and staffing schools on reservations, and maintaining relationships that continue today. In 1896, when there were rumors of war between the United States and Great Britain, Murray Shipley, one of 3 recorded ministers at Cincinnati Friends meeting, along with William H. Taylor and Anna M. Johnson, thought it provided
a great opportunity to proclaim the principles of our society in opposition to all war, and our advocacy of peaceful means of adjusting all international difficulties. Murray Shipley, 1896.
And he added that the aim of the Friends was
not to translate Christ's teachings into a free rendering adapted to the customs of the day, but to uphold his standard and let the world become not only anti-slavery, but anti-war.
This optimistic 19th century hope was short-lived. Instead, in the next century, Quakers everywhere found themselves repeatedly challenged to uphold the peace testimony with its underpinnings of equality, truth, and simplicity.
War breaks out in 1914, and England first. There's a problem because Friends in England, Quakers in England, are clear that they are pacifists. What they do in England is to establish the Friends Ambulance Service, which was a medical corps, independent of the army. Young men, principally Quakers, but not exclusively Quakers, who would volunteer to drive ambulances and serve as medics at the front.
So Rufus Jones and James Babbitt and Henry Cadbury and some other Quaker leaders of the time decided that they needed a similar organization for American Quakers so that they could do something, so they could serve without serving in the military way.
It was then, in 1917, that the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC, was formed to feed, clothe, and provide aid to the victims of war.
If you look at the uniforms, they look exactly like the uniforms that the American military were wearing in that conflict. And that was because they were actually buying surplus Army uniforms, right, and outfitting these young men in this. So when you see the uniforms, they have on the sleeve the red and black star, which was adopted as the logo for the American Friends Service Committee.
And there were a lot of young Quakers and other members of peace churches like the Mennonite and the Church of the Brethren who did not want to go fight. They were willing to serve, they were willing to die, but they couldn't kill. So while there were bombs still falling in France, American Friends, American Quakers, and British Quakers were rebuilding farmhouses and helping people whose whole towns had been destroyed. Quakers went in there and were rebuilding even as the destruction was still happening.
One of those devoted members of the American Friends Service Committee was Wilmington, Ohio native Luther Warren.
Luther Warren tells just this amazing, powerful story about spending the day with this French family. And at this point, all that's left of this family is grandma, mom, and a little girl. And so Luther and a couple of his partners are working together to build this home for this family. They're so grateful to have this home, have a roof over their heads again. Luther and the men leave to go back to their camp and find out first thing in the morning that the battle lines have shifted. And so they have to go back to this same family and evacuate them from this home that they just built. What's really amazing about this story is Luther Warren, Maynard Mackay, Mark McMillan, all of these young men from this area, they're having, first of all, these cultural experiences that farm boys from Southwest Ohio have never had before. But to think about the courage that it took to say, no, I don't believe that is something that I can participate in, and so this is what I'm going to choose to do instead. And then to know that they were in just as much danger as the young men who were carrying rifles.
Some of them worked as medics or in hospitals and other functions, but hospital work, and this was common, to work with refugees and children and young mothers, a kind of focus, that kind of relief. I like this combination, trying to make changes that will have long-term and broad effects. American Friends Service Committee has done that.
According to Wallace T. Collette, who served as chairman of the American Friends Service Committee in the 1970s, its organizers in 1917 were inspired by a quotation from William Penn.
Let us then try what love will do, for if men did once see we love them, we should soon find they would not harm us.
Though the Great War came to a close in 1918, the work of the American Friends Service Committee continued.
Something close to 1 million children a day for a number of years were being fed by this relief work in Europe. That work had a really powerful legacy because they weren't just feeding French children. They were feeding German children as well. They were feeding anyone who needed to be fed. There's a man named Joe Volk who, for a number of years, was the executive secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. In the 1970s and 1980s, he was traveling in Germany, and they were working on kind of East-West relations and anti-nuclear weapons kind of work. But he was talking with some officials in kind of high up in the German government, and at some point was just kind of really personally amazed that these people were so willing and open to talk with him when they weren't willing and open to talk with other people. And so he finally asked somebody, what is it? Why me? Why us? Why the American Friends Service Committee? Why are you talking to us and you won't talk to anyone else? And this German official said, because I wouldn't be here if you hadn't fed my parents. So we're talking about a generation after, right? This guy's parents had been fed by Quakers in the years after World War I. So we think a lot and we hear a lot about the ripple effects of conflict after the conflict is over, but to think about the ripple effects of humanitarian aid and of peace work generations after that's happened, and I think that's a story that doesn't get told enough.
By 1940, it was clear that another major conflict was brewing in Europe. Robert Jones, minister of Cincinnati Friends Meeting, attended a gathering in Richmond, Indiana, for the purpose of, as they explained, discussing what Friends can do in this world of confusion. He reported that the American Friends Service Committee was trying to work out with the government some sort of service for the conscientious objectors should war come. The result was the Selective Training and Service Act, which included an exemption from combat for any person who, by reason of religious training and belief, is conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form.
During World War II, federal law restricted the alternative service of conscientious objectors to projects within the United States. So you saw conscientious objectors who worked as attendants in mental hospitals, who worked in forestry camps doing conservation or firefighting work. All the bravest conscientious objectors volunteered to be guinea pigs in medical experiments, testing vaccines for various diseases, or even taking part in starvation experiments that were aimed at getting a better understanding of how former POWs or concentration camp survivors could be nursed back to health. So they were brave in their own way.
Several Quakers from the Midwest took part in these dangerous experiments.
Wayne Overmeyer participated as human guinea pigs in some of these experiments during World War II. David Stoffregen was the first Quaker in Cincinnati to register as a CO for that war and to sign up for the CPS camps.
Another young Quaker by the name of T. Canby Jones was also a CO during World War II.
Canby's a very, very interesting fellow, a PhD from Yale. He was a conscientious objector and worked with the COs in Norway, as well as some places here in the United States. And is also a big biblical scholar. He was born in Japan. His father was a missionary. His father became the principal or president of a black university in the South where he was raised. So he's always been on the cutting edge in many different ways.
Canby later became a beloved professor and peace activist at Wilmington College in Ohio, where he was known on campus as Mr. Quaker. Barred from sending relief workers to battle zones during World War II, one wartime concern the American Friends Service Committee addressed was the plight of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans arrested on the suspicion of being enemy aliens after Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941. Entire families were imprisoned in temporary internment camps until they could be relocated from the West Coast by the newly created WRA, or War Relocation Authority.
Within 48 hours of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that basically rounded up hundreds of Japanese Americans that lived on the West Coast and put them in internment camps, identifying them as enemy aliens. They had to sell their farmlands, close their businesses, and they went to these camps literally with only what they could carry. They were told that they had to stay there until the military order was lifted or rescinded or modified. G. Raymond Booth was a former Quaker pastor and had been a former executive secretary of the Pacific Coast Division of American Friends Service Committee. He was the first representative of the WRA here in Cincinnati and met with members of Cincinnati Friends Meeting to discuss his concerns for helping Japanese Americans get settled.
In response, a hostel was established, temporary quarters where Japanese Americans could stay until employment and more permanent living arrangements could be found. A University of Cincinnati dormitory was leased for use as the hostel, and Booth led by example, hiring the first internment camp member to relocate to Cincinnati, his secretary, Elva Shinozaki.
Cincinnati Friends were greatly involved in this. They would coordinate picnics with the young Japanese Americans. They invited them to come to worship, and about 700 individuals took advantage of the services offered through the hostel. Several of the people who lived there felt welcomed enough by Cincinnati Friends that they just decided to join the meeting, to become Quakers themselves.
After the hostel closed, Cincinnati Quakers continued their relationship with the Japanese, contributing funds to rebuild a Friends school in Japan which had been destroyed by bombs. Meanwhile, as it had after World War I, at the end of World War II, the American Friends Service Committee sent relief workers to help rebuild Europe. One young Quaker who joined that effort was Robert Bob McCoy, who grew up on a farm in southwestern Ohio.
Then the American Friends Service Committee went over to war-torn Europe and began doing the work of feeding the starving people who were there, both German and Austrian and Russian. I mean, they didn't just go feed the children of allies, but they fed the children of the enemies. And Bob McCoy worked there for about 4 years after the war.
One day, while out driving a truck, Bob's work partner had quite a memorable experience with a local villager.
As he went along from village to village, he would stop and pick up people if they were walking and looked like, and he had room. And so he picked up this elderly man, gave him a ride to the next village, and the old man came around the side of the truck and asked, "How much do I owe you?" And the guy, the American Friends Service Committee fellow, said, "You don't, nothing, this is what we do, you know, we're here to help." And the old man glanced up and he saw the Quakers insignia and he said, "Ah, Quakers, that explains everything." And that was left over because they remembered what Quakers had done in World War I. And that makes me think about that saying from William Penn, "Let us then try what love will do." And I think love given freely during and after World War I was remembered 50 and 60 years later and had an impact 50 or 60 years later on your enemies. I mean, that's such a powerful lesson. And it gives credence and weight to the teachings of Christianity and of Quakerism.
After the war, in recognition of this Friends Service Committee in England and the American Friends Service Committee are awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. It's international recognition of the alternative to warfare that Quakers, in their best sense, represent.
Over the next 3 decades, the social and political focus of Americans and much of the world shifted from Europe to the growing civil rights movement within the United States. In 1954, 5 black parents in Hillsboro, Ohio, brought a lawsuit against the local school board for its policy of segregation in the schools. In its ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education earlier that year, the U.S. Supreme Court had abolished the separate but equal rule under which Hillsboro's African American children had been educated in segregated schools for decades. The NAACP helped provide legal counsel in the Hillsboro suit. Thurgood Marshall, who successfully argued the Brown case, wrote the briefs and signed the petition submitted to the district court in Cincinnati. One of the parents, Imogene Curtis, approached local Quaker meetings in nearby Leesburg and Wilmington and requested their help. This was how the Freedom Schools of Hillsboro, Ohio, also known as the Kitchen Schools, began. Rebecca Godfrey's mother was involved with the effort.
My dad happened to be serving on a committee at the time for the yearly meeting that received the request. He came home and he informed her that he had volunteered her to go to Hillsboro once a week and help with the schooling of these children. So the group of Quaker teachers, there were 4 of them, would go to Hillsboro on Mondays and meet and work with the children on that day. And then they would leave lesson plans for the mother teachers to carry out for the rest of the week. And that's how they became known as the kitchen schools, because a lot of them, they sat around a kitchen table, 4 or 5 children.
During that, lifelong bonds were established between the black parents and the Quaker teachers.
I was at a family reunion with my teenage son, who invited his friend to come. And his friend is biracial, and I said, "Are you have any relations in Hillsboro?" And he goes, "I think so. I said, "Imogene and Orville Curtis by any chance?" And he says, "Well, my dad was Orville Curtis, and he was named after his uncle, and I think that they lived in Hillsboro." And so here, my mom had worked with Miss Imogene in the kitchen schools, and 2 generations later, her grandson and Orville Curtis, her husband's great nephew, are best friends. It makes you kind of proud that your mom had a part of that.
When American involvement in the conflict in Southeast Asia escalated, so did Quaker concern. Friends everywhere protested the war. Wilmington College, under the leadership of Quaker presidents, became a focus of Quaker activism. Gary Kersey, a graduate of Wilmington College, recounts his time at the school during the peak of demonstrations.
I saw this demonstration starting to unfold. I remember there were those who opposed the war kind of lining up on one side of the sidewalk, and those who were in support of the troops were on the other side. And I thought to myself, I can go back down the back stairs of College Hall, get in my Cougar and go to Hardee's and avoid this whole dilemma as to whether I'm going to be a part of this, whether I'm going to be for the war or shall we say against the war. And I must say that I think I had reached the point in my life that up till that time, most everybody had been telling me what I ought to do and what I ought to say and what I ought to feel. I had a lot of good teachers, I had wonderful parents, had a lot of good people telling me what to do, but here was a case where I was going to have to make this decision myself. And I think there's a lot of people out there that maybe have a certain feeling, but they just don't capture that feeling because they're afraid of what people will think, that they're not, that's not what it's all about.
Though many people struggled with how to respond to the war, Wilmington College professor Larry Guerra and his wife Lena May did not. The Guerras were involved in a plethora of vigils and demonstrations during the Vietnam War and were quite familiar with the consequences of acting upon their beliefs. Larry served multiple prison sentences for his challenges to the system, beginning during World War II.
I was only arrested once during Vietnam. I don't take civil disobedience lightly. And in 1942, when I was supposed to register, I couldn't do anything else. It was a matter of conscience. I publicly announced that I could not, in good conscience, register. And of course, when I did that, when I was 20 years old, I was sentenced to prison for 3 years.
Years later, accused of counseling a student to refuse to register for the draft, Guerra was sentenced to prison for another 18 months, separating him from his wife, Lena May.
We'd been married, 5 or 6 years, I think, then. And, that was kind of difficult, very difficult. But I was young, he was young, we were healthy, we got through it.
I've regretted a lot of things I've done, but I've never regretted refusing to register. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, and still feel that way.
Throughout the Vietnam War, Quakers everywhere held peace vigils, and in May 1970, Cincinnati and Wilmington Friends joined other religious groups in protesting the killing of 4 Kent State University students by the Ohio National Guard. Current Cincinnati Friends member Jim Crocker Lackness was a student at Kent State. He remembers that morning.
The Guard moved into the fenced-in area and found themselves blocked, couldn't move. So there was a moment of back and forth between, there were about 8 or 10 of us in the parking lot, and the National Guard would shoot their tear gas, and we were able to run downwind of the tear gas and pick it up and throw it back. And then I found myself, I had picked up a rock, and I found my arm cocked, ready to throw this rock. And time stood still. The universe vanished. And I heard Jesus say, Jim, are you sure you want to do that? Drop that rock and follow me. And so my conscientious objection to war nonviolence, based on the teachings of Jesus, came back to me. I did drop the rock.
Another influential Quaker actively involved in following the peace testimony was Wallace Collette, a World War II conscientious objector from Wilmington, Ohio. After graduating from Wilmington College, Collette moved to Cincinnati, where he became a prominent businessman and civic leader, and eventually became chairman of the American Friends Service Committee.
Wallace was up front, out in the open with his war tax resistance. Every year he would fill out his 1040 and he'd get to the bottom and he'd write a note and attach it telling the IRS that he had not paid X dollars because he considered them to be dollars that supported the military. But then he went on and he would tell them, I have deposited that amount of money plus whatever, 10% for the penalties that I know you're going to assess, plus any interest that might be due. I put it all in this bank account. He'd give them the bank name and the account number so they could go and get that money. So he was going to resist the taxes. He knew that they were going to want it, and he wasn't going to try and stop them from getting it. In fact, he ended up paying more because he knew they were going to assess penalties and interest on it. All that money was in the bank, but then he did something else. This is the good part. He knew the presidents of most of the banks in Cincinnati, maybe all the banks in Cincinnati. He would open an account in a bank, put the money in, but then he'd make an appointment with the president of the bank. And he would go in and he'd say, "Hi, Al, how you doing? It's good to see you. Listen, the IRS is going to come and they're going to seize my account." Well, you can imagine the shock that this would cause. I mean, this is a prominent person in our community, and he's telling me as the president of the bank that they're going to come and seize his assets. And so, of course, what do I do as the president of the bank? I said, "Why? What's going on?" And Wallace would then have the opportunity to tell them about what war taxes represented, why they were wrong, and what he was doing to resist them. It gave him an opportunity to minister to prominent people, people with power and authority in the business community. And I just think that's just such a tremendous example for all of us.
Over the years, others like Jim Crocker Lackness faced difficult choices related to the peace testimony. Such was the situation of Ryan Myers during Desert Storm in 1990. But after some guidance from fellow friend and conscientious objector Charlie Pearson, Myers was more confident in his decision.
Looking at having to register for selective service, that I was not going to. So Charlie Pearson, who was a member of the meeting as well, was a CO during World War II, was a bit of a mentor for me when I was young. I think I took some strength from that, knowing that, okay, I know Charlie, I respect Charlie. He was able to do it, he was okay. Of course, when I was making the decision, I knew it carried potential legal consequences. The possibility of a pretty substantial fine, prison time, and I'm not eligible for student loans. But I think it was the right decision for me. I think if the circumstances were the same, I would make the decision again.
In recent years, some Quakers have, as their predecessors did, focused on projects to provide education equality. With the support of her local Friends meeting, Cincinnati Quaker Kathy Barney has put her energy into an arts program for underprivileged children.
I started it because I just knew that there were kids in my neighborhood that didn't have the options and opportunities that the average kid has. Yet these kids were just as valuable. I hope to provide a safe place for these kids. I hope it sparks something in them that maybe an area, an opportunity would open up that they hadn't seen before.
It's just a way to be creative and get your hands dirty.
We painted stuff and we got like one of those hats that the artists wear.
Some of the kids have told me they really like to come here because it gets them away from the daily drama where they live.
I keep coming back because sometimes when I have a bad day, this is the only place I can go to, and it makes me feel better about myself. I miss Kathy and Miss Pat and all of them teaching me the important responsibilities and stuff in life.
I think it really gives them voice, self-expression. If these kids have a venue for self-expression, then they know who they are. They have a voice, and they can say no to bad influences. They know who they are. I think it makes them stronger.
If I would learn something, it would be just how to help people and teach people how to do the art stuff.
I'm just a different person. I'm more mature and I know how to handle situations better.
I think one of the Quaker principles that has always spoken to me is seeing that of God in others. and being able to see that of God in these kids and helping them see that in themselves. I mean, I think that's sort of in a nutshell what the whole point is.
Also supported by Cincinnati Friends Meeting, Luke and Angela Ebner expressed their faith through work with inner city youth, exposing them to organic and sustainable gardening, planting seeds of hope.
The kids that work with us get to learn how to plan, plant, harvest, market, cook organic fruits and vegetables that are all grown right here. I always say we're planting nourishing habitats for community. So this is a nourishing habitat that I get to cultivate with the youth that we interact with.
Living in the urban community is really hard to have that time of meditation and peace because there's always so much going on, and this is a highly populated area. So being in a secluded area like gardening, it brings you a peace that you never even knew existed. And it's truly a blessing to be able to grow food and to just be out, because putting your hands at work can really allow your mind to meditate and just flow. Losing yourself while being in the grass or tending to the plants and whatnot, you really get the opportunity to think.
Life outside the garden is much like a challenge. It's much like working at the garden. Like I said, putting forth effort to do anything that you want takes practice, hard work, and dedication.
There was a time in my life I had nowhere to go, and I had to come to this garden, and Lou gave me a job. He made sure there was money in my pocket and made sure there was enough for me to help support my family. This garden means everything to me, truly. What I've learned about equality while working here at the Eco Garden is that we all are in the same boat. No one is better than no one else. Even though someone might have better clothes or might have a better career or better options or opportunities, at the end of the day, we're all human beings with the same faults and issues. At the end of the day, we're all afraid of the same thing. So truly, there's no point in seeing anyone above you or below you. There's no point of insecurity, because we're all in the same boat. We're all scared of the same thing. We all seek the same thing.
Public friend and minister Donnie Hayden believes that several things particularly attract people to Quakerism: social activism and the affirmation that there is that of God in everyone, which includes the understanding that anyone may be led or guided by God.
We attract people who are deeply involved and socially conscious and committed to social justice. But the other kind of person is a person who is tuned in and listening and can hear or can be led. And so finds themselves among others who are of similar leading.
For me, for my family, that component of equality has been a large piece of what has kept us here.
Quakerism has really helped us focus ourselves outwards, because you can see the effect that it has on everybody else, and you feel like you're contributing to society and helping others.
Quakers believe that each of us has the responsibility to become a minister and to minister each in our own way to the community and to the wider world as well.
My attraction to Quakerism has always been on the side of the experiential approach to religion, that it is that you have an immediate experience of the presence of the Spirit, and out of that grows your values and your commitments.
It is just discovering that you can have an actual one-on-one relationship with your Creator, and that you can know the joy and the peace and the beauty that God created us to know.
Through more than 3 centuries, Quakers everywhere, famous and anonymous, in East Coast City and Midwestern countryside, have heeded George Fox's admonition to answer that of God in everyone.
if it were proper for Quakers to be proud, I think we're entitled to be proud for the many ways that we work to try to make the world a better place, and particularly focused on people who were marginalized and disenfranchised by the larger society. And I hope that's something that will always be true of Friends, that we will always be willing to be countercultural, not for the sake of being odd or just for the sake of being different, but because by running counter to the larger culture and its values, we ultimately move it toward being a better, more just, more radically fair world.
My life flows on in endless song above earth's lamentations. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the turmoil and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds that echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? What though my joys and comforts die, the Lord my Savior liveth. What though the darkness gather round, songs in the night he giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that refuge clinging, since Christ is Lord of heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? I lift mine eyes, the cloud grows thin, I see the blue above it, and day by day this pathway smooth, since I first learned to love it. The peace of Christ makes fresh my heart, a fountain never springing. All things are mine since I am His. How can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing?